Yo guys, what's going on? Welcome back to a brand new video where today we are going to talk about Diablo 2 Resurrected versus Diablo 3 and kind of get into my own subjective opinion about which game is better. Now to get started, I'm going to go ahead and dive into some of the pros and cons about each game. One thing that I will note is that some things that I might think are a con about one of these games, somebody else might think is great. So a lot of this is subjective, but after we do the pros and cons, I'm going to go ahead and dive into what I believe are the more debatable differences between the game, where you could categorize them as a pro or a con. Alright, so to get started with Diablo 2, and to dive into the first pro about this game, is that you can play with up to 8 people in a game, as opposed to just 4 in Diablo 3. In addition to that, grouping up in Diablo 2 feels easier than Diablo 3. When it comes to running bounties, though, you can just kind of click join game and get into a public game pretty quickly, but when it comes to doing things like greater rifts, you kind of have to organize a group on your own. Now, of course, there are advantages to organizing a group on your own like that, because you can make sure that the players you get form a good composition for running greater rifts. Having said that, when you're kind of just feeling lazy, it's really nice to just click on a Bale run game or click on a Chaos run game and kind of just tag along or carry the group. So for the next pro for Diablo 2, getting good gear like this Griffin's Eye or this Enigma feels very, very rewarding. In Diablo 3, you're pretty much just handed a full set with the Hadrig's Gift at the start of the season, and even if it's not good, you can use that to easily gear out your character in just one day of the season, if not just a portion of the day. It feels a lot less rewarding in general to get good gear in Diablo 3. Having said that, the Primal Ancients were a very good addition to the game, because this is one of the drops that feels a bit more rewarding. But at the same time, when I'm playing Diablo 2 Resurrected, and a high rune drops, let's say a Jaw or a Bear rune drops, I'm ecstatic. Like, I'm really thrilled about getting that. As opposed to when a Primal Ancient drops, most of the time I'm just thinking, oh, it's probably garbage. It's probably some item that I don't need, that I'm not going to use. It's just 15 Forgotten Souls at the blacksmith. The next pro that I'm going to talk about with Diablo 2 is that the D2R community generally seems really happy with the continued development of this game. I kind of thought this was going to be like a classic WoW situation where the community would have exploded with rage if there were any changes made to the game other than the new graphical interface. Having said that, the dev team seems to have done a really good job and is implementing new changes and new additions to the game that the community actually seems pretty happy with. Alright, so to dive into some of the cons about Diablo 2. I think for a new player, somebody who's just coming into the game and getting started without much knowledge, is generally very punished because they make bad decisions in their skill tree. In addition to that, when a new player starts putting in their stats, they're generally putting them in a very suboptimal way. When you're starting off the game, you've really only got one chance at a respec, at least when you're going through normal mode. New players that are making mistakes, and then they opt to use their respec because they think they need to make it another way, and then they end up screwing it up again, end up in a really bad place. So to kind of wrap that up, I think that Diablo 3 in general is a lot more user-friendly, especially to new players who are just getting into the game. Okay, so for the next con in Diablo 2, there is like no end game whatsoever. It's pretty much just all about getting better gear. There's not really anything to push towards. Once you've beaten all the bosses, you've beaten them. And yes, you can kill them over and over and get faster and faster at it, but the end game itself, there's just not much to it. You're not necessarily pushing towards a goal unless you're kind of going for level 99 or just getting good gear. Okay, so next up for the cons, and again, could be a little bit subjective, but you can play for days at a time without getting anything of value. You can go into the game and spend hours and hours of magic finding and get absolutely nothing and just kind of feel like you've wasted your day. The next con is that early season, the class balance is absolutely atrocious. The Sorceress is by far the best character to start the ladder season with. When this game first launched and everybody was playing and pushing towards getting through Hell mode, everybody was a sorceress. You might see the occasional paladin splashed in, but generally speaking, everybody knew that they kind of had to play a sorceress because they have the teleport ability without needing to get Enigma. So whenever a new ladder starts, I kind of feel like if I want to play competitively, I am trapped into picking the sorceress or maybe the paladin. I'm personally not that much of a casual gamer, and so to feel like I'm trapped into playing a certain class to go through the whole game, magic find for hours on end just to get gear that I can eventually put on another character, it's a little discouraging. Okay, so to round out the cons for Diablo 2 Resurrected is that scamming is rampant in this game. In Diablo 3, there's no trading, and so there's not really much of a scam scene going on in that game. Most people who've played Diablo 2 for long enough know about the Shaco scam, where you'll put this into a trade window. Let's say you're the scammer, and the other player will put up a rune to offer for your Shaco. You'll both hit accept to make the trade, except the scammer has a full inventory, and so the trade won't go through. They'll go ahead and run back to their inventory and swap out the Shaco with just a basic cap that has an emerald in it. Then they'll run back to make the trade with you again, and you'll just kind of think, as the victim, that, oh, they just had a full inventory and had to put something in the stash. But instead, what they do is they'll go ahead and put that green cap into the trade window, you'll put your rune in, you'll assume that it's a Shaco because it looks identical to it, you'll hit accept, and next thing you know, you just traded for a basic cap with the gem in it, and the other player is walking away with your rune. There's a whole slew of other scams when it comes to Diablo 2 that are similar to this. For example, people putting up an Enigma in the trade window, and Enigma basically just looks like whatever basic item you put it in. So for example, the Enigma on my Amazon is made in a worm hide. So let's say I wanted to scam somebody. I'm just going to go ahead and put this into a trade window. Somebody else is going to put up their offering. I'm going to hit accept. Oh, my inventory's full. I'm going to run back to my stash, and as the scammer, I'm just going to grab a worm hide that doesn't have any runes in it at all, go ahead and put it back in the trade window, and hit accept, and hope that you don't double check that it is in fact the Enigma. So basically there is just a bunch of trade scams that people can run in Diablo 2, and people constantly fall victim to it, especially if they've never been scammed before and they don't know about these tricks. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about Diablo 3's pros and cons. For starters, the combat in Diablo 3 is so visceral. When you hit an enemy, it feels good. You can really tell that there's an impact and there's such an animation that really makes it look like they are being hit, versus Diablo 2 where it kind of looks a little clunky when you're in combat. Even with the changes made in Diablo 2 Resurrected, the combat itself does not look nearly as impressive as in Diablo 3. Next up is that Diablo 3 is available on consoles. I've played it on the Xbox and I had a really good time. It's very fun to sit down on the couch with a friend and just play a casual character. So the next thing to touch on with the pros is that the seasonal themes are generally pretty good. When they first started in Season 14, they were pretty underwhelming. I think the Season 14 theme was like double goblins, so every time you hit a goblin there'd be two, and like maybe for a casual player that's cool, but it really was underwhelming in general and didn't really feel like it added much to the game, other than maybe slightly speeding up how much you're going to get gear and gems. These days the seasons are great. This season we've got, of course, the Angelic Crucible powers, which have really created a lot of new builds or added a lot of power to existing builds that has just made it feel so much different to play this game. Maybe D2R will start eventually doing something like ladder themes, where they maybe do something similar to this, but generally speaking, each ladder of Diablo 2, you're kind of just doing the same thing all over again. Okay, so next up for Diablo 3 is that the gear looks so much cooler. One big problem with Diablo 2 and gear, and this really kind of came into play with the Lord of Destruction expansion, is that the best gear in the game is generally these really low quality items that you add runes to make fantastic rune words. But ultimately, it kind of looks like your character is just wearing trash gear. Hopefully one day D2R will do something where once you have created a rune word, let's say in an Archon plate or a Mage plate, that it actually changes the appearance and makes it look nicer. There's also so much customization in Diablo 3 with the transmog feature, where you can basically make your character look like anything that you want. They even have the dyes in the game where you can change the color of your gear, so there's just a ton of customization for making your character look better. Okay, so to dive into some of the cons about Diablo 3, I'm going to start off with the Paragon system. I feel like it's really nice in the sense where there's always this sense of constant progression, but having said that, it really gives a huge advantage to people who are grinding hours on end or running a bot just to get a ton of Paragons, and it gives them this huge advantage when it comes to the leaderboards. Although the endless scaling gives us something to do, it adds a big problem when it comes to the competitive aspect of this game. Ultimately, the game becomes more about how many Paragon levels do I have versus how well am I playing my class and how good is my gear. Okay, so next up is that Diablo 2 Resurrected doesn't really have much of an endgame. However, Diablo 3 has a pretty lacking endgame. Basically, the endgame is just running greater rifts and turning up the difficulty. It's not like you're getting exposed to new challenges and new bosses or anything like that. You're just running the same thing over and over and over and just scaling it up as you get better gear. Hopefully this is something that Diablo 4 fixes, and instead of just spamming greater rifts all day, we're actually progressing to beat certain major bosses or really difficult dungeons. Next up for the cons for Diablo 3 is that it is online only. Now personally, I pretty much only play Diablo online, but I know for a lot of people this is a major con. Especially for people who live in areas where the internet is really lackluster, or maybe they're kind of just off the grid and they don't have access to internet. Next up is that in Diablo 3, PvP was not delivered as promised. Diablo 2 PvP has a lot of problems. There's absorb gear, there's dueling styles that are known as BM or bad mannered. Having said that, at least there is a PvP community in Diablo 2 that feels active and generally respects the rules of dueling. We were supposed to have an arena system in Diablo 3 and it never happened. And to round out the cons for Diablo 3 is that the launch for this game was so terrible. Of course, there's the famous line from Jay Wilson, who said that they had all of these great competitive players playing Diablo 3, who said that the difficulty was great, and then without any further testing, he just goes ahead and said, yeah, we doubled it. Doubling the difficulty of the game was a very bold move without enough testing to actually make sure that this was a reasonable idea. In addition to this, I've got a webpage up right now about Error 37. If you played Diablo 3 at launch, you probably remember running into this error. This was a huge problem when the game launched, and people were constantly hitting this error. If you weren't playing at launch, or if you don't remember this, I'd recommend looking into it. There's a ton of memes online just talking about this and reminiscing about how terrible the launch was for Diablo 3. Ultimately, the big issue with the bad launch is that I think it really harmed player retention in this game. People lost interest really early and never came back to the game again. Had they made a smoother launch, I really feel like Diablo 3 would be in a much better position today. This really would have just helped with player retention in general. I genuinely believe that a lot more people would be playing Diablo 3 today had the launch been better and so many people didn't just quit immediately and never come back. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into some of the more debatable differences between the game, where I don't know if I would necessarily categorize them as a pro or con, and I'll leave that up to you. The first one, and this is a major difference between the games, probably the biggest difference between the games, is the loot system. We had kind of touched on this a little earlier in the video, but gear in Diablo 2 Resurrected feels so much better to get than it does in Diablo 3. There is so much more rarity to some of the best items in the game that getting them is almost a status symbol in Diablo 2. In Diablo 3, legendaries are just raining down on you. Every time you clear a greater rift, there's just a bunch of beams sitting everywhere with legendary gear. Although it's nice to find a good piece for your character, it happens too quickly, and you don't really get that sense of accomplishment when you've actually geared out your character nearly as much as you do in Diablo 2. Now, for some people, they may enjoy getting gear really fast and just diving into whatever build that they want to play. Other people really like the RPG aspect where you are going on a journey and really putting in a lot of effort to finally get to this end goal where you've got a phenomenal character. It's hard for me to say that either one is a pro or a con, but I will say that in Diablo 2, it does feel more rewarding. Next up is charms. In Diablo 2, if you remember, the charms really added a lot to your character, but the downside to them is that you have no inventory space. I felt like they were a massive inconvenience, and although it was great to feel like I had added so much power to my character, playing the game, picking up loot becomes a lot more inconvenient when your inventory is constantly just cluttered with charms. Alright, so next up in this one is huge. Trading. You can trade in Diablo 2 and D2R, but you can't trade in Diablo 3. My problem with trading is that it can absolutely create this pay-to-win culture. Anybody can go on D2JSP or any of those websites that are known for selling Diablo 2 gear, swipe their card, and just get elite gear. At least in Diablo 3, you actually have to build up your character. You have to go find those ancients, and you have to find those primals. It's really unfortunate that in Diablo 2, there is absolutely a pay-to-win option. Having said that, I can't necessarily say that trading is a con. Trading really adds a lot to the game, being able to interact with people and spend time exchanging gear to make both of your characters better. It also makes it really nice to find any good item, regardless of whether or not your character can wear it or utilize it, somebody else can. And that gives you a lot of power to build your own character by just making trades with people. So next up is kind of the Tetris inventory system thing. I'm not personally a huge fan of it, but I know that a lot of people don't mind inventory management. I would definitely say that it is a lot more difficult in D2R versus Diablo 3. In Diablo 3, we have greater inventory space, and most items cannot even take up as much space as a lot of items in Diablo 2. Here's an image that I found online of a matriarchal bow. This item completely fills your inventory top to bottom for 2 columns. There is absolutely nothing in Diablo 3 that is big enough to fill 2 of these columns and go all the way to the bottom. In addition to that, you also, of course, don't have the charms cluttering up your inventory. So having gone over this, a lot of people do enjoy the Tetris aspect. I kind of personally see it as an inconvenience, but I know that a lot of players enjoy it. Okay, so the last thing to talk about is rune words. Rune words are a huge part of D2R. Now, I think there's a lot of pros and a lot of cons to having rune words. For starters, getting a high rune feels incredibly valuable. I don't think there's any piece of gear that can drop in Diablo 3 that feels better than a bear rune dropping in Diablo 2. But the issue with rune words that I have is, take for example a barbarian who gets a grandfather, a weapon that was just awesome in the original version of the game. But then Lord of Destruction comes out, and all of a sudden these barbarians can use grief. Getting a grandfather to drop now is more of a novelty than a great accomplishment. Generally speaking, for a lot of pieces of gear that drop that would otherwise seem really good are just made completely obsolete by rune words, and this is especially prevalent with weapons. So to go ahead and sum up this video, I'm going to give you my honest opinion about which game that I think is better. I personally enjoy Diablo 2 more. Now lately I've been playing a lot more Diablo 3 because I'm really enjoying Season 27. I absolutely love what they've done with the game this season, and so I picked this over the D2 ladder that recently started. I think that a big factor in it is nostalgia. I remember playing Diablo 2 all summer long for hours on end every single day and just having a blast building up my character. Who knows though? One day, my opinion could change. Once I move on to Diablo 4, and I've been away from Diablo 3 for a while, I might get that same feeling of nostalgia to go back and play Diablo 3. Outside of the nostalgia aspect, what I really enjoy about D2R is just the sense of accomplishment from gearing out your character. I personally believe that an action RPG should be about building up this incredible character with good gear. The biggest problem that I have with Diablo 3 is that good gear is just too easy to get, and you get it too quickly. Well guys, I hope that you enjoyed this video. One day I may do some Diablo 2 content as well. We'll kind of see what the season theme is for Season 28 and see if it's maybe just as good as this. If that's the case, I'll probably stick around on D3. But I have been interested in going back to D2R, especially with the introduction of Sunder Charms. I have yet to test them out, and from the content that I've seen, they look like a really cool addition to the game. But go ahead and let me know what your thoughts are down below. Which game do you think is better? Do you agree with my points? Do you disagree? I'm open to any feedback. Alrighty folks, I genuinely appreciate you for tuning in. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.